Okay, so remember that time that we all stood about 6 feet apart from one another and policed each other and we threw a bunch of masks on children in order to slow the spread? Well, it turns out there might not be much scientific evidence to back those choices. Shocker! Let's talk about it.
Yeah, you better. Yeah, you better.
Alright guys, before we get into today's video, I want to give a big shout out to all my patrons on Patreon. As you know, we can get taken off these platforms at any moment, and specifically in talking about subjects like this. The last strike we got on this channel was actually for talking about this subject matter in particular, so we're gonna tread lightly, but shout out to you who have supported us in the meantime while we're trying to struggle through having these conversations. Now, recently some testimony has been released from none other than Dr. Fauci, and this was testimony that took place in January, where he was being questioned about all the different COVID regulations that were pushed out to the general public and that we were told to follow. Things like staying 6 feet apart from one another, throwing masks on children under the age of 5, because there doesn't seem to be much scientific evidence to back up these choices and regulations. Yet you and I were almost forced to comply. If we didn't, we could have been fired, deplatformed, arrested in some instances. There was a lot going on in the 2 years that we all experienced the COVID pandemic, and of course it's ongoing, but as the regulations have let up a little bit, people are starting to question things, and they're thinking, did we really need to do that? And if we did, where's the evidence to back up those claims? Now, it seems like Dr. Fauci himself doesn't even have an answer to that question. Let's read the transcript. Question: do you recall reviewing any studies or data supporting masking for children? Answer: you know, I might have, Mitch, but I don't recall specifically that I did. I might have. Question, and I apologize for the poor wording here before we get into it. Since there's been a lot of studies that have come out since the pandemic started, but specifically on this, there have been significant on kind of like the learning loss and speech and development issues that have been associated with particularly young children wearing masks while they're growing up. They can't see their teacher talk and can't learn how to form words. Have you followed any of those studies? Fauci answers no, but I believe there's been a lot of conflicting studies too, that there are those that say, yes, there is an impact, and there are those that say there's not. I still think it's up in the air. And we'll pause there before getting into the 6 feet social distance thing. Let's listen to what was said. He's asked if there's any studies that support masking on children. He can't recall whether or not that he read those studies or if he has reference to any studies that support that claim. That's an interesting thing, considering how aggressive we were with throwing these masks on children under the age of 5 who were doing quite well when they contracted COVID and were relatively healthy when it came to experiencing that illness. And this is information that we gathered pretty quickly. Yes, kids were getting COVID, but they weren't having super severe reactions to COVID. In fact, they were doing quite well. But still, we threw masks on them and everyone else around them. They couldn't see half of everyone's faces, their mouths, their emotions and smiles. They couldn't see the way their mouths were moving to create speech, let alone hear that speech properly. They couldn't properly socialize with their peers of the same age. And when you couple that with not being able to go to school and online learning and all the other crazy stuff that was happening at the time, we really set kids back, multiple steps back. But I guess the studies are conflicting on that last part, so don't take my word for it. It's interesting that Dr. Fauci can remember the conflicting studies on the effects of masks on things like speech and learning, but he can't remember a single study that defended his view that children should wear them. And then of course we had a ton of other COVID regulations, or I guess what they'll call them now, recommendations, and that included the 6 feet social distancing rule. We all went to the grocery store if we weren't getting our groceries delivered and spraying them down with Lysol, and we stood on those little circular stickers they put on the ground 6 feet apart all the way up and down the aisles, at the checkout line. We got harassed by people on the street who told us to stay away from them. We were getting too close. We stood 6 feet apart at birthday parties and graduations, even funerals when we're meant to be together grieving. Oh wait, we didn't stand 6 feet apart at those because we weren't allowed to have those. I remember now. But anyways, let's hear what Dr. Fauci had to say about that 6 feet apart rule. Question: do you recall when discussions regarding kind of the at least a 6 foot threshold began? Answer: the 6 foot in the school? Question: 6 foot overall. I mean, 6 foot was applied at businesses. Answer: Yeah, question. It was applied in schools, it was applied here. At least how the messaging was applied was that 6-foot distancing was the distance that needed to be. Answer, I don't recall. It sort of just appeared. I don't recall like a discussion of whether it should be 5 or 6 or whatever. It was just that 6 foot is. Question. Do you see any studies that supported 6 feet? Dr. Fauci answers, I was not aware of studies. In fact, that would be a very difficult study to do. Now, I'll be charitable in my interpretation here. I imagine that it would be quite difficult to conduct a study that proves that a 6-foot space between people is more effective than that of a 5-foot space or a 7-foot space. It might be pretty difficult to even come to a conclusion on what the exact space should be at all. But juxtapose this sort of flippant, I don't know, it just came out of nowhere answer with the rigid ideology of 6-foot social distancing at the time that we all experienced. People were getting in trouble for not having social distancing policies in their businesses and establishments. People were policing one another, telling on one another for not social distancing. We even went as far as to have people putting hula hoops around their bodies to keep people away, or taping yardsticks together to make sure that everyone kept their 6-foot distance. All to find out that the 6-foot social distancing just sort of happened. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not placing all the blame on Dr. Fauci. He has a big role here, but it was most definitely a collective effort on behalf of our institutions and government to impose these regulations on us. But when you have a clip of Dr. Anthony Fauci saying this,
it's been proven that when you make it difficult for people in their lives, they lose their ideological bullshit and they get vaccinated.
You start to figure out, and pun intended, unmask, why all of these regulations just sort of happened. I think in part there was sort of this idea amongst leadership when it came to the COVID pandemic that we can throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. Let's throw a bunch of regulations out there, make people comply with them, and hopefully something works to slow the spread. But there's also a sinister interpretation that during this pandemic, the powers that be decided that they were going to pack on as many regulations and steps onto us as possible in order to make our lives more difficult. And in making our lives more difficult, we would take whatever steps necessary to relieve ourselves of those regulations, including getting a little ouchy from Dr. Fauci. Because wouldn't it be great to start attending birthday parties and family celebrations and even funerals again? Wouldn't it be great to be able to see everybody's faces, understand what they're saying to you, get to see them smile, for kids to recognize their speech pattern and go through the normal stages of development? Wouldn't it be awesome to tell your 2-year-old that he could finally take the face diaper off? Wouldn't it be amazing if we could be close with one another, hug one another, be less than 6 feet apart from our family, friends, and loved ones? And all of that can be yours if you just get one poke in the arm. Oh wait, not one. We want you to keep coming back because that's more effective for you, not because it makes us money. Oh, couldn't be that. And of course, we're not liable if you have a reaction to this thing that we've pushed out and expedited and made sure that we've rushed. We're not liable for that. Okay? So come and do it because you don't want to deal with the social distancing, right? And you want to take the mask off your child, right? Trust me, it's science. In fact, I'm the science. Trust the science. But months or years from now, when you sit me down and ask me about the science that I'm referencing in order to make these decisions, I'm going to look you dead in the eyes and say, I don't recall. So in summary, the world was overwhelmed by a virus that came from a bat. That's what we're going with, right? Not a lab anyways. And then we were told to social distance and stay home and not be in school. And when we were out and about, or even with our families, try to wear a mask and make sure that you can't see half of the faces of people that you are interacting with. And we thought kids will do fine with that. Let's throw them on them as well. All this to say, if you felt crazy in 2020 and the years since, you probably weren't. You can take off that tinfoil hat that everybody was accusing you of wearing, although it never really was there, much like the studies that are referenced in order to impose these regulations on us. And I could use this video to talk badly about Anthony Fauci more and more and more, but I actually want to use this time to question ourselves. So many of us blindly followed these so-called recommendations from institutions like the CDC and men like Dr. Fauci. We didn't even question them. There was no amount of skepticism. And maybe that's a lesson learned here. They were so confident in telling us what to do with our bodies that we probably thought they must be telling the truth. It's the CDC after all. But it turns out when the heat of the moment is over, that confidence that we saw in them wasn't really there after all. And who knows what made many of us blindly follow these rules. Maybe it was anxiety and fear. Maybe it was the perceived authority. And there's a laundry list of other options. I'm sure you'll drop them in the comments down below. Because there's a million different things that we could impose on other people in a stressful or fearful moment. But it doesn't mean that those millions of impositions are right or backed up by science. And this is not the first discovery of somewhat frivolous regulations when it comes to the COVID pandemic. And I have a feeling it won't be the last. So we should all take this time to reflect and remember this moment. And for those of you who are already on board, already following this, you weren't crazy after all. And those are my thoughts. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Let me know how you feel. As always, if you disagree with me, I encourage healthy debate, so duke it out in the comments down below, but do so respectfully. And if you like this video, like, subscribe, click the notification bell to be notified every single time I post a video for you guys, which is every day. And I will see you next time. Stay 6 feet apart.
Yeah, you better. Yeah, you better.